Okay, guys, we're back, and we're going to talk about the second issue that I think is a developmental issue that all of us have problems with because we're human, again, unless your belly button disappeared. And that is an issue called boundaries. And you might have heard this word. And I'm going to unpack it a little bit, but we're going to talk a little bit about how, overall here, what we're talking about is healing. And we're talking about, remember, the clinical arena, the emotional problems, the depression and stress and addictions and anxiety, the relational issues, and then the performance issues. Underlying many of those, now I said earlier that sometimes they're caused by disconnection, but sometimes they're caused by a lack of boundaries. And that's one of the first things, in this section I want to emphasize as well, because now we're talking about different issues, right? Bonding and now boundaries. Think of your symptoms: stress, depression, addictions, relationship struggles. See, those are problems, obviously, but those aren't the problem. Psychologists call those symptoms. If you're trying to diagnose somebody with a major depression, for example, you're looking for the symptoms to be able to diagnose the problem, right? So doctors will call that symptoms. If you go into the doctor and the doctor says, "So how are you doing?" and you're going, "Well, I've got some symptoms. I kind of clogged up, or I've got a stomach ache." It's something that you feel that's wrong. Now, the Bible's word for that is fruit. They're both the same thing. The issue is not the symptom. We can treat symptoms, and we do, because they're uncomfortable and painful, but we got to get to the tree, because it's the tree that's producing that fruit. So the tree may be disconnected. There's no root system where it's taken in the love we talked about earlier. But maybe that's not the problem. Some of you might have grown up with so much connection you can't find air to breathe. Why? Because you weren't allowed to, or maybe you haven't developed this thing called boundaries. See, connectedness is about our being one. Okay? Boundaries are about our being one apart from the ones that we're connected to. You see that? See, we have oneness together, but the nature of the universe is we have a God who is a connected one with separateness of relationship with different identities. There are three different people in this relationship. Now, what happens with that baby? Same thing. They come into life, the first thing they're looking for is connection. And you feed them, and you feed them, and you nurture them, and you care for them, and you support them. And they're just like facing you all the time, until they're strengthened enough to all of a sudden do a U-turn, and they want to go away. That's perfect. That's how God designed them. Now, they're becoming, see, they've moved towards, but now they want to go out here and experience their autonomy and their freedom and their separateness. And see, sometimes people have grown up or whatever, and they've had their ability to be separate people from the ones they love. And what does that mean? Well, it means I have my own choices. I have my own feelings. I have my own beliefs. I have my own talents. I have my own desires. All right? That's great. But what if, in the relationships that somebody's in, when you start to say to this person's got their own, choices, feelings, attitudes, behaviors, and all this, and this person says, well, I want you to, can you do this with me, or can you come to this meeting, or can you do this for me, or can you work extra, or blah, 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 and you say, the magic boundaries word, what is that? No. which is a complete sentence, by the way. You say, no, I don't want to do that. Well, if you're in a good relationship and you say, no, I want you to go to lunch. No, I think I'm going to stay home. And this person relishes what the Bible says Jesus died for. You ever thought about that? Galatians 5:1 says, it is for freedom that Christ has died. Don't ever become subject to a yoke of slavery ever again, it says. But see, a lot of times people's relationships are a yoke of slavery. Because, no, I think I'll stay home. And this person immediately judges that freedom and says, so you don't love me? What, you don't care about the ministry? What, you don't have time for me? See, we're to love each other's yeses, but we're also to love and respect each other's no's. And it's interesting. In a lot of places, no is a sin. Even though Jesus said, let your yes be no and your no, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything beyond that, he said, is from the evil one. And a lot of times you hear people, they can't say no. What they'll do is they'll say, well, no, because, I can't do that because, my house is going to burn down that day and I have to save humanity. And there's a lot of explanations for their freedom. Because they feel guilty about our freedom. You get in a team, some people feel guilty or have fear of maybe expressing their own thoughts and beliefs about something. Or let's get to the harder stuff. The harder stuff is boundaries. We're talking about what they really do. Basically, a boundary is a property line. That's all it is. This property here, we've got a property line. Now, when you have a property line, this property line, I got a neighbor over here. I got a neighbor over here. Well, this property line does some essential things of existential reality as God has created it. A property line defines the boundaries, and it defines a host of deeply, deeply theological constructs. It basically defines who owns this. Okay? So if you own your home or you rent your home, you own the rights to that home. You've paid for that. You own in a lease agreement, you own the rights to use it, which means if you own it, you also control it. Okay? That also means that you're responsible for it. And it also means that you are free to do whatever you want to with it. All right? Now, what if my neighbor all of a sudden decides, I think your house ought to be green. And they come over here and they start to invade my property. What's the Bible's word for that? What's the legal word for that? Trespassing. You ever wonder why the Bible uses the word, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us? It's the stepping over the boundary and invading something that belongs to somebody else, their life. It's a violation of those boundaries. And see, what the Bible says is that you and I were designed to have control. So turn to your spouse. We have a bunch of couples here today. Turn to your spouse, look them in the eye and tell them the truth you've always wanted to tell them. Say, you are a control freak. And you know what? You're right. You're absolutely right. And here's why. Here's why. God has made everybody to be a control freak. You take a little toddler and you play the thing where you're hammering on the little pegs. And if they're watching you, if we hook the toddler's brain up to a scan, and he or she's watching me hit them, their brain's kind of sort of interested in looking, has a little activity. But then I say, okay, now you do it, and I hand them the hammer, their brain goes crazy. Because now they got control. Right? But what kind of control do they have? the only kind of control that you were designed by God to be a control freak over, and that is self-control. Wow. It is a fruit of the Spirit. Wow. It is a result, it is a realization of the freedom that Christ died for you. But in our fallenness, guess what? We lost control of ourselves, and now we try to control everybody else. And the fruit of the Spirit is not other control. It's self-control. But, remember responsibility? So we got ownership, you got control, you got responsibility, you got freedom over here. Well, what if somebody over here feels like, I want you to do something for me, or I'll give you another example that you see more often. Let's say that somebody over here is not taking responsibility for their own behavior. Let's say they have an addiction or an anger problem. See, the Bible tells them to have self-control in that area and to mature and to gain stewardship over their life. But let's say they're not taking responsibility for their addiction. What happens? Well, what happens is it starts to spill over into your yard. And now you are experiencing the consequences that should fall into this yard. So that's why an addict never tries to destroy a family. An addict's just trying to avoid responsibility for their own life. As a result, they end up, the consequences, the law of sowing and reaping says that whatever we sow, we should reap. Unless we have codependents around us who they'll shoulder the reaping of the pain of my addiction. And the Bible doesn't know anything about that. So what you have is you got somebody's got an anger problem, or the controlling behavior, or they're controlling their kids, or controlling their spouse, or they're addicted, or they're abusive. And what they do is they step over here into this yard, and this person's too nice and loving to say no to that behavior. Wow. They're what we call codependents. Yeah. See, it's interesting. You know where the word codependent came from? Back in the 60s when they were studying addictions, they found that you can take an addict. Originally the term was not the terms we use today. It was called chemically dependent. They had CD units in hospitals. And a chemically dependent person had a diagnosis. They'd go into a CD unit, chemically dependent, substances like alcohol or heroin or whatever. And then they would treat them and they'd get sober. Then they send them home and they would relapse at home. And so they bring them back in and then they get sober. And then they send them home and they relapse. And then they go, what the heck is going on at home? Well, they go to the home and what they find out is, like we all know, you can't be addicted by yourself. You need help. Somebody's got to call the boss and make excuses for you. Somebody's got to cover the finances that you're not doing. Somebody's got to double raise the kids while you're not doing your job. You need help to be an addict. In other words, someone was enabling this behavior. And then they go study this enabler. And guess what they found out? The enabler is enabling this behavior. Why? Not just because they're nice and loving, but because they were dependent on the approval of the addict. They were scared to upset the addict. So you got the chemically dependent person, and guess what? We have a codependent. That's where that term came from. Now, lest you think the addictionologists are the brightest people in the world, which they were, but they don't get credit for this. The first addictionologist was Moses, because he wrote the first book on how to overcome codependency. Go back to Leviticus, very, very clear. He says, do not hate your neighbor in your heart. He says, rebuke them frankly. And then he says this, do not pervert justice. See, justice is about doing what's right and requiring that right be done, right? It says, do not pervert justice. Watch this. He says, it's Leviticus 19, 15 and 17. He says, don't pervert justice. Do not be partial to the needy, nor defer to the great and powerful, or you will share in their guilt. See, that's what they told the codependent. You're part of the problem because you're allowing this to go on. And they go, exactly what the Bible says. Well, I can't, what do you want me to do? Cut my kid off? He's so needy. Or I can't cut my spouse off because they're so great and powerful and they'll get angry at me. See, it's either we over-identify with the weakness and don't help people to get well by requiring them to get well, or we don't confront the great and powerful because we're afraid. Wow. That's not what Esther did. And it's not what Jesus did. When somebody, he said, well, I don't know, do you want to get well? Get off your butt and do something, right? I remember when I was running, isn't that same pastor? Did I get that right, Pastor? He kind of requires people to do stuff, right? When I used to do a lot of work in my clinical world, psych hospitals, you get somebody and they're really, really depressed, and we admit them. They come in maybe through the emergency room that night, and you admit them, and they're depressed, and they just think about this. You're depressed. You've been wanting to get better. You go to this hospital, and they feel like they're going to make me well, and which we were, right? But they go to bed and they go, oh, this is going to be great. Well, it was only about 6 or 7 hours later when Nurse Ratched is at their door. Okay, you got to go. Let's go. We're going to group. Here's your workbook. You got to sign up for your chores. You go to the community center. The group starts at 8. I want you to fill out this stuff and come share. Yeah. And they're going, what? But I'm depressed. Yeah, you are depressed. And we're not going to pervert justice. We're going to help you. We're going to give to you. And you're going to be responsible to respond to what we're giving. And what happens is this law of sowing and reaping just gets perverted all over the place. If you've ever heard me talk about this, I probably told this story. One time a family came in to see me, and it was a mom and a dad and 2 adult children. Adult children, I always say that's an oxymoron. Like, Microsoft works. You can't put those words together. 20-somethings, young man, young woman. And so I say to the dad, I go, so how can I help? He says, I want you to fix my son. I turned to the young man and said, so what's wrong with you? He said, no, it's my brother. I said, where's your brother? And the father goes, he didn't want to come today. I said, well, where is he? He said, well, he didn't want to come. I said, why? He says, because he doesn't think he has any problems. And I said, well, maybe he doesn't. He says, oh, yes, he does. I said, well, maybe he doesn't. I mean, he's not. So he's getting kind of angry. And I said, okay, so what are his problems? He said, well, he's got a drug problem. I said, well, that could be serious. What's he on? He said, he's been smoking dope since he was about 15. I said, well, how old is he now? He said, he's 23. I said, okay, so he's mellow. So what other problems does he have? He says, well, he's flunked out of 3 colleges. I said, flunked out of 3 colleges? He goes, yeah. And I'm sitting here bewildered, like, how the hell do you do that? No, seriously, think about it. And I said, I don't know how you do that. He said, what are you talking about? I said, I know how to flunk out of 1, but how do I get in the second one? And the father says, because I'm on the board. And I got him in, wanted to help him. And they got him on the board. He said the second time, the first time he flunked out because of all that partying in the dorm, and I wanted him to have a nice, quiet place, so I bought him a new condo off campus. Because we all know partying doesn't travel, right? And he said, I wanted him to have time to study and work on it, so I made sure he had plenty of money. And he flunked out again. Imagine that, kids, And he said he flunked out a 3rd time. He said, doctor, we've done everything. And I'm going, oh my gosh. And so then the father says, you could see his heart, you get this picture in there. And he said, but the thing that bothers me the most, he says, when I was his age, I had started 3 businesses. He said, he's 23 years old, and he doesn't even have a college major. And I thought for a second, and I turned to him and I said, well, where where is he today? He said, well, I said, I know he didn't want to come, but where might I find him? He said, he's in Vail. I said, Colorado? He said, yeah. I said, what's he doing in Vail? He said, he's skiing. I thought for a second, and I said, you know what, I'm sorry, sir, I can't help your son. He said, why not? And I said, because frankly, I'm a psychologist, and I help people with problems. And I'm with him. I don't think he has any. He says, what do you mean, doesn't have any? I said, the man's in Vail skiing. He's got plenty of money. He's got a new home. I'm a psychologist. I help people with problems. He doesn't have a problem in the world. I said, so I can't help him. I said, but you, on the other hand, I can help you. I said, because you got a lot of problems. Because what are you talking about? I said, you got a drug problem, a can't find my niche problem, a flunk. He said, that's not me, that's my son. I said, no, he doesn't have any of those problems. He's in Vail skiing. Does that sound like a man with problems? I said, you, on the other hand, you're in a psychiatric hospital. What kinds of people come to psychiatric hospitals? People with problems. He goes, well, I don't know. I said, you're here. I can't help him because he doesn't have any problems. I can help you, though, because you got a lot of problems. Here's how I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you to help him to have some problems. I'm going to teach you about something called boundaries. Now, what are we talking about here? What we're talking about is the law of sowing and reaping. See, Joey over here snorts or smokes dope or skips school or whatever, and Daddy pays for his behavior. The sowing's happening here, the reaping's happening over here. So all we got to do is realign the created order and the Levitical law that Moses said of, look, we're going to put some limits around not Joey. Joey can do whatever he wants. But the father's got to get back in touch with his own boundaries. And the father's got to say, I desire to give to you, but I will only give to you. Send me the grades after the first quarter and another check will come. But if they don't, it won't. And you see this human enabling behavior, the upside downness of the law. So you see it in abusive marriages. Somebody is getting abused all the time, and why? They can't say no because most of the times they're so broken and dependent. They need the person's love so much, or they're afraid that, as God says, they're being oppressed. Their boundaries have been mowed down to where they don't even have the least little bit of a half of a fence. And they get invaded all the time. Why? Because their no muscle is broken. And see, and a lot of times in the faith, we've turned the no muscle into a sin. In fact, I remember, and you probably remember too, there's a famous parenting program talking about kids with strong wills. And what it says is, you've got to break their will. A lot of Christian parenting programs would say that. You got to break their will. Do you know what the word will means in the Bible? The Greek word for will, it means desire. And I would hear that and I go, you don't break the will, you redeem the will. You strengthen the will. You discipline the will so it desires the things of God instead of desiring and willing to give into abuse and drugs and sex and all the bad stuff. You break a kid's will at 2 and you put them in the back seat of a car at 16 when somebody's taking advantage of them and they hit that icon that wants to say no and that will's broken. This is part of the image of God. I want strong-willed kids. Because I want them to take the kingdom like he says. But you're going to do that if you're passive. You're going to do that if you're a people pleaser. You do it out of discipline and strengthening. And you take an abuse victim, many of you pastors have people, they're struggling. And a lot of them, it's not even in their marriage. Sometimes you got to get them to a shelter and all that. I understand, those are the cases we usually say, come on, we got to help you stand up to this. We got to get you to safety. Sometimes you have to call the cops. But where a lot of this misery comes from, it's not even in overt abuse. It's in guilt and manipulation and shaming. And people feeling like they have to give more and more and more. A bunch of you are working way more than you should be on two fronts. One is bad leadership. Everything we know about leadership is a leader that tries to do everything will accomplish nothing. A leader that is able to build a system around them where they delegate autonomy and freedom and responsibility and control to an army of people. We'll see those people go hit the pegs for themselves and take over cities. And you may be the ceiling because you feel like you got to do it all. This happens in parenting as well. We got helicopter parents that feel like they got to do everything for the kid instead of frustrating the kid to have to go do it themselves. I remember when my kids were little, and I learned this from a friend, a phrase I heard her say one time. Olivia came to me and said, I'm bored. And I said, well, everybody's responsible for their own fun, so go find some. But that's true, right? Or you see parents now, the kids got a squabble at school, and they'll call the school. USC, I read this in the paper, they have a whole department, parent relations. Because now kids are in the dorms having squabbles, texting mom, and she calls the school, and they got to deal with mom to deal with the parent, to deal with the kid who's not dealing with the roommate. Are you kidding me? See, there's so much thriving when people have control of themselves. So I want you to look at yourself, and I want you to ask yourself, how's my no muscle? Am I being abused? Sometimes it's not in the church. Sometimes it's not in a marriage. Sometimes it's extended family. One of the biggest places we see this is marriages that are dominated by one of the spouse's parents. What a violation of the created order. It says you're supposed to leave and cleave. And they're not saying no to extended family. Or they're not saying no to addictions in the extended family. They're still enabling, or they're bailing out somebody with money or time or energy. See, the Bible says that you have a certain amount of treasures. They're your feelings, your attitudes, your behaviors, your choices, your talents, your thoughts, your loves, your desires. And that you're to steward those. See, a steward has control. Now, I am not talking about not saying yes. See, we're to lay down our lives and give and sacrifice. Okay? But nothing's ever supposed to be stolen from you. And we're not supposed to give and sacrifice to irresponsibility and to sin. That's not giving at all. We're to give to the needy. We're not to give to the irresponsible. For example, 1 Thessalonians 4, what does it say? Comfort the brokenhearted, help the weak, and confront the unruly. Wow. See, not everybody's the same. We'll give everything to somebody that's broken and needy and oppressed. But if somebody's not taking responsibility for themselves and they're stealing from other people, we're not going to give to that. And we have to, you want to make all this really simple? 2 Corinthians 9:7. Here's what it says. Give as you have purposed in your heart. See, that's a decision. This is what I'm going to give to, and this is what I'm not going to give to. God's called me to certain things, or I have inclinations, or whatever it is, to certain things. Give as you've purposed in your heart. And then it says this, not begrudgingly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Take those two words, begrudgingly. Where does begrudgingly come from? It comes from when pressure is put on me from the outside. I'm not giving, I give in, and then I hold a grudge. Right? Under compulsion, I don't even need any pressure from the outside. I got enough in my head. Well, I'm bad if I don't go to that meeting, or I'm bad if I say no to this, or I'm bad if... How many instances in the Bible do we see where people missed out on God because they couldn't say no to not God? Moses is out there doing the ministry, listening to people's cases, doing what he was called to do. And his father-in-law, Jethro, comes and says, Moses, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm doing what I do. I'm listening to the cases of the people. He was a marriage counselor, basically. He says, I'm helping the people. And his father-in-law says, Moses, what you are doing is not good. You will surely wear yourself out. Pick other people that are talented, give them all of these cases, and you reserve the hard ones just for yourself. You have limits. You're not the whole freaking neighborhood. You're one position. You're one person. And in our fallenness, we want to be omni, don't we? Omnipresent, be able to do everything. We want to be omnipotent, be able to control everything. See, I can't control whether or not my kid studies. I can just control the resources and the requirements. Yeah, that's great. God has called you with a certain talent, a handful of talents, a context, and he says, Ephesians 2, that there's good works laid out that you should walk in that are specifically for you. Some of you are struggling because you've never defined the basic boundaries of knowing who you are and who you're not. We don't have all the gifts. Don't have them all. Romans 12, which is basically one of the only places I know in the Bible where it says how to find the will of God. Everybody has that question. Well, there's one verse that says that. It says you present yourself to him, a living and holy sacrifice. And then it says don't be conformed from the outside. Don't be squeezed by all this junk that they're telling you you ought to be and should be and you're all of this. It says to differentiate yourself from that. Don't be conformed. Don't just because your neighbor pushes you, pressures you, the church or whoever it is, parents, says it starts with saying no. Identity formation always begins with a no. It's the first word. Identity starts to form when you're an infant. Your basic identity is I am loved, I belong. Your second identity is I am me and I'm not you. Don't be conformed to the world, it says, by the transforming of your mind. It says, and then you will be able to know the perfect, good and perfect will of God. And right after that, you know what it says? It's basically about this. It says, don't think more highly of yourself than you ought. A lot of people think they ought to be everything. They ought to be able to preach like the best. They ought to be. And see, they never can grow because they haven't learned, first of all, to live in their own skin. And who am I? So I got to start there. And then it says, right after that, it says, find your gift and just exercise it with a lot of faith. And you know what happens to people who do that? That little football player in this backyard exercises that gift, doesn't think he or she ought to be, or he ought to be in the NFL and run across the street and hit some 300-pound guy. He just does it here, and then he gets too big for this yard. And then God increases his boundaries. He gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But it starts by saying no to what you're not. God, one of the greatest things I ever saw in this regard, I had a good friend who was a famous football player. I used to play golf with him. He called me one day. He said, mind if my son comes with us? And I said, no, bring him. His son was 16. This guy was like the scariest human, the father. Huge, monster. I'm waiting for monster number 2, his son. So this little squirrely, geeky kid walks up on the first tee, probably weighed 90 pounds wet. And I meet him. He said, "Hey, this is my son, and so, we're playing. And I'm kind of expecting. And so his father says, so Jake, tell him what you're doing. Tell him what you're doing." You can see the father is so, into his kid. And he said, "Well, I'm really into theater and music." And he starts talking. He just got this audition for this part, and you could see his dad just beaming at who this kid was and not requiring him to be who he wasn't.
That's great.
And just, see, so many times people have never even been able to define who they are.
Yeah.
And the Bible calls you by name. God calls you by name. He has a special name for you. The other thing about this is that we don't teach enough that there is no verse in the Bible that says, "Blessed are the doormats, for they shall inherit the hills." That's not in there. We don't teach people enough to not tolerate bad behavior. You go to Psalm 101, just go read Psalm 101. David says, I'm going to paraphrase, the paraphrase of the whole chapter is, "There's a bunch of crap I'm not going to put up with." That's the paraphrase. He lists certain behaviors. He says, "The arrogant I will not tolerate. The perverse will not be near me." And perverse, he doesn't think of sexual. Perverse just means to twist something. Manipulators. People that, there's perverted love. There's perverted serving. He says, "I'm not going to have anything to do." He says, the haughty, the raised eyebrow, the narcissists, the judgmental. And then he says, the liars. He says, "I will not tolerate, get them far away from me." And then he says, "It is the faithful of the land that will minister to me." Back to bonding. See, he needed people, but he was going to get close to good people and keep the hurtful ones away from him. And that's every bit of the Bible. There's always two tracks to the life of God. There's love and there's righteousness. And there's a righteous way to love. And taking abuse is not the way to love, or enabling abuse is not the way to love. Love has laws to it. And we get in trouble when we divide them. And see, what God wants us to do is speak the truth in love. So when my neighbor hurts me, I'm not supposed to nuke his yard. I want to, but I'm not supposed to. You go to him in private. You set a boundary. You say, "You know what, that wasn't cool." Or somebody you're close to, or somebody on the team, or whatever. Don't do that. And then here's what's interesting. It says, if they're wise, they'll hear you, and you've solved the problem. But then it says, but if they don't, then go buy them an ice cream cone. Or tell them again. Or try to please them into it. It doesn't say that. It says if they don't, go get a friend and go with them. And then says if they want to do that, ultimately you get to an intervention, and ultimately you get to, if you're not going to get sober, you can't live here. It has a progressive setting of boundaries, just like your immune system does. We don't teach this. It's also interesting in Matthew 18 where you see that progression of boundaries taught. That's the place in the Bible you hear the word binding. Now, I know we use it in the supernatural and all that, but here's what it says. It's talking about the relational setting of boundaries on people's problematic behavior. And it calls us to do that. And then it says this, "For whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in the heavens, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in the heavens." It is see, we're talking about a stewardship of an incarnational body here, that he's delegated the responsibility, again, to the body to contain this infection. I mean, why, when a church sees a husband being mean to a wife, why doesn't a friend go up and contain that and say, "Dude, that's not okay"? Or whatever it is we need to do. So pastors, my biggest concern for you is this. You're probably suffering in boundaries because you're getting overspent. You're getting depleted. You feel like you got to say yes to everything. Find a Jethro. You know, when Jethro came to Moses, what you're doing is not good. Find a good, there's got to be a really seasoned CEO in your church, or a coach, or a leadership coach. Get with somebody that's going to help you figure out from your chair, what is it you should be saying yes to, and what should you be saying no to? Because that's the only way you're going to multiply, but it's the only way also you're not going to be burned out.
That's right.
And whatever people in your life that are grinding at you, it could be an elder, it could be whoever, that this enabling of this, they're a splinter in your side. You know what Paul says? Reject a divisive person after a second warning. Stop putting up with that, even on your team. And once they're gone, you won't believe what happens. That's probably some of the places you're hurting, but it might be some of the others we mentioned as well. And when you do it, you'll see depression, anxiety, addictions, relationship problems, fruitfulness, all of that really start to change.